Is investor sentiment a market indicator worth considering? That's what I'm thinking about. You might hear the term investor sentiment in various publications and in the news, and they talk about are investors optimistic or are they pessimistic about what the future of the market holds? And I've never really paid much attention to that, given that when the herd thinks one way, I tend to be a contrarian and think differently, or hopefully at least independently. And I was recently reading an article, and they had a really nice graphic going back 40 years on what investor sentiment has been, and sort of overlaid it with the S&P 500 represent U.S. stocks. But these these greenish areas here, bullish, that's when investor sentiment is positive. In green, investors say, hey, we feel good about the future. And then the blue things, that bearish, that's when people feel bad about what they think going forward. And two things really caught my eye as I was looking at this. Again, the neat details, you can pay attention to what's going on in each of the categories, but kind of look over on the left-hand side there, going back to the early 2000s, and take a point from about, 1999, 2000 on the S&P 500, where that red line is, and go forward, 10 years, you go from 99 to 2008 sort of a thing. Some of us can remember the lost decade, right, where the S&P 500 was flat. You can see that in that flat across. And look at the investor sentiment largely over that period, right? Largely bullish in that green area, meaning investors felt pretty good in general, it looks like, over that decade. How'd that turn out for the stock market? Right? And keep in mind, as I say this out loud, that the index here, that doesn't include dividends. That doesn't tell the whole story, right? But it tells, this is part of the story for sure, right? The lost decade, markets are flat, and people felt pretty good about things. Take a look over on the right-hand side now. The last, 5 or 10 years, a heck of a lot more blue, right? A lot more negative investor sentiment. People think that things aren't good in the future. And how does that red line worked out for us the last decade or so? Right? Investor sentiment not so hot, investor returns substantially, up. And then go back to that, period in the 2000s, investor sentiment pretty positive, returns not so awesome. And you can cherry pick different times. Just I encourage you to spend a little time looking through this. But what I take from this, like what's the takeaway, what's the actionable thing, is again that thinking independently side of things is, some people will say when investor sentiment is positive, that means bad things, and when investor sentiment is negative, that means good things. I tend to think in that direction. That might not necessarily be the case as you look at this graphic, but what I do take away from this is that investor sentiment, it might be a negative indicator, contrarian maybe, but it certainly isn't anything that on a reliable basis I look at and go, oh, it's something that we really need to take into consideration as we look at what our expectations of the future are. It's sort of, the investor sentiment and what market returns do seem to be pretty independent to me. So that's what I'm thinking about today. As always, interested in knowing what you're thinking about. Jot me a note in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube, or shoot me an email directly. And as always, thanks for watching.